Okay, Mick, thanks very much for joining me. We've managed to get the dogs out of the way. We've discussed the England versus Australia cricket debacle. And we're now ready to get into talking about services procurement and outsourced MSP provision in that area. Been looking forward to this conversation for ages and really glad we've managed to get together. Thank you very much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks, Johnny. Thanks for having me on the podcast. I'm looking forward to it as well. This is something I'm really passionate about. Services procurement is a huge opportunity. I think it's an area that is pretty much untapped. Unfortunately, it's not through any nefarious activities or anything else. It's a big nut to crack, and it's a lot for an organization sometimes to really get involved and figure out how to kind of operate this and how to use the best tools or services that are available in the industry, such like yourselves, and that really be able to figure out how to use those tools correctly and drive the most value for their organization. So I'm really glad to be here today to have this conversation.
Superb. Like you say, big nut to crack. 20 trillion in annual spend on services procurement across all these different categories is the estimated kind of market number. So a massive area of spend for organizations, hugely important as the world transitions more and more towards services-based industries, and services-based spend becomes more and more important. But an area you've got a lot of expertise in from this position of when organizations are outsourcing the problem of managing this tricky area to managed service providers. Obviously, with where you started off, coming originally from Australia, now being based in the USA, and originally kind of starting off with a more of a technical computing background. Do you want to just talk a little bit about the journey you've taken to get to where you are today and to build up the expertise that you've got?
Sure. Yeah, as you said, I started in a technical background. I was computer science. I worked my way through doing that process, like coding and building networks and all that fun stuff for organizations and government organizations as well. And then as you progress through time, you start to move yourself up the chain, and you start to focus more on from the execution down to like, how are we going to get things done in a better or more efficient way? And in doing that growth and that realization, I started to come to the conclusion, which is nothing unique, is that the best resources might not be necessarily people you can actually touch in the office with you, or be in the building next to you, or whatever it is. And so started to explore the broader world, the large Indian consultancies, some very large multinationals out of the US, and seeing what they could actually provide and be able to incorporate the best of what they could deliver. And in doing so, it started to really open my eyes to the way of how we actually do that purchasing and buying process. Structuring those contracts so that way, again, it's not just I'm hiring a body to turn the crank. I'm really looking for a solution on how to do this, and a true partnership. And so, as I progressed through my career, I was able to kind of leverage that and be rather successful in making sure I was able to do those things, which resulted in going to really start help on the MSP side. I got engaged with a really good global MSP, and what I was able to do was help expand them with their practice and be able to start bringing it from the MSP side into a client rather than from a client reaching out. And I think we started to really develop a really good practice on what we could do there, and start to really show that we could deliver what we needed to do. So I feel like I'm not totally unique, but I feel I have a different slant on it because I do understand what we're trying to do. Coming from the IT side, it really blends well into services procurement kind of process. And I really feel that I'm able to bring a slightly different perspective there and fully appreciate and understand not just the tactical, what I need to get done, but making sure we can craft solutions that are able to deliver on what their goals are.
Yeah, and I think that expertise in services procurement is absolutely critical, obviously in the sense that that's the service that you're providing, but also when that's juxtaposed against these managed service provider organizations, they're typically large staffing organizations, and which makes complete and utter logical sense in one way, which is that they're just different ways of getting work done. for organizations. They're just different modes of capacity and capability for organizations to be able to leverage to get things done, whether it's a permanent employee sitting there, whether it's a contractor that's engaged, or whether it's a company providing that's delivering a service on an outcome basis. So it's all about how companies get things done, and that has changed massively over time as well, obviously with things like the gig economy and moving away prior to that, moving away from this whole kind of like permanent job for life type setup. And outsourcing and the provision of services is just something that's grown massively. But I think when you look at that juxtaposition with staffing, sometimes for some companies they can look at that and it can be a bit confusing for them. So you need to have specific areas of expertise within those organizations, because it is a different thing as well. It's a different mode of operation, isn't it?
It is. You just got me having a drink. Yes, it is. At the end of the day, it is. It's a different way of operating. It is different from the traditional staff recruiting or staff augmentation approach. But that being said, I do like the approach or your comment you made. It's really about getting access to capacities and capabilities of organizations and finding ways to do it. At the end of the day, buying is buying is buying. Like, as much as it might, ruffle a few feathers with procurement people, but at the end of the day, the actual transaction of acquiring is somewhat similar everywhere. You establish the agreement, the requirements you need, you come into what the contract looks like, and then you execute against the contract. The magic there is the capabilities of the organization, making sure that they align with delivering on what your actual objectives are. And that's still the key thing that needs to get done. And that should be the focus of what it is. The actual buying process should be somewhat routine, and we should be able to standardize that. And that's where leveraging a lot of those VMS tools and things like that is, we can just turn that, whether it's a Reba for purchasing or whether it is a VMS, it really is around, that's just standardization of process. And then a good MSP can kind of come in and they can really help you drive some efficiencies around that. But the magic is really figuring in upstream what we need to do, how we kind of establish those requirements, making sure they're able to deliver on those requirements, and that delivery is actually going to be what the final outcome is going to be. So I think that's magic.
Yeah, and you're talking about something in services procurement that is quite fluid. I always kind of use the analogy of looking at the procurement of goods and materials versus the procurement of services as being almost like diametrically opposed, in the sense that when you're procuring goods and materials, generally what you're procuring is quite simple to define. You know what it is, you know what it looks like, you know how much it weighs. It's fairly binary in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. But the supply chain can be incredibly complicated. Typically, and I'm generalizing here, in services, it's the opposite. What you're buying is very difficult to define, hard to tie down, but there's a simpler supply chain. So I think with services procurement, it always seems to me like the two problems are, how do you define effectively what it is you're going to buy and build that into a contract that actually has a clear deliverables. But then also, how do you measure the delivery of that? And how do you measure all the fact that things change along the way? Because, you take an IT project, for example, if it's working on an agile methodology, or any kind of project can just change when it's a service, because, you don't necessarily have all the information when you're starting out. So there's a lot more flexibility involved in the delivery, which makes it harder to capture the information.
True. Yeah, no, I agree. To counter a little bit, though, we live in a world where we, on an everyday basis, we actually operate that way quite comfortably. Your car breaks down, you take it in for a service, it's broken, you don't know what the fix is, and you're going to say, hey, I engage you to fix my car, but I have no idea of price, what it is, I don't know what the problem is, but I'm willing to work with you to do that. And so you put in place stage gates, as it were. Like, as soon as he does his investigation, he calls you, you talk about what it is, you work on what your how it's going to be, how the pricing's going to be, but you still have that defined goal at the end of what you want, the outcome, the working car. So we have that flexibility. We deal with that flexibility, should I say, in everyday life, and we're okay with it. I think sometimes we just get wrapped around the axle a little bit in the business world. We kind of treat it a little bit differently when we don't need to. Like, we're quite, I tend to think people are quite bright. They're able to figure this stuff out quite comfortably. They've just need to. I think there's an element that's missing in probably a lot of conversations, is that emotional element that we need to make sure that at the end of the day, the person who's negotiating the deal is just working their way through a process. We don't need, there's a lot of investment. They get rewarded on putting in a good product into place, etc. But we're going to make sure that their emotional investment and they're wanting to be able to control everything doesn't really override the outcome of what it's supposed to be and somehow inhibit it. At the end of the day, we know what the outcome is. Very few of us are like Google, where they go, here's a $10 million, go find, create something great for us. It's like, I need a website, I need a new service, I need a new system installed, I need to whatever. So we know what the outcome looks like. We can define, we just need to help put a process in place to figure out what those goals are, what is all those margins, what's the quality, to make sure that they're delivering as they're supposed to do. The quality gates are going to be in there. And then once they're in place, we're then able to track and then adjust accordingly. Like if there's something wrong, we can shift and adjust and do that. The legal side can be adjusted very easy. Lawyers are very bright. They can figure out exactly, like if we need to shift, adjust contracts, word the contracts so there's some flexibility in there and all that. But it's really making sure that that business process is in place, that we know what we're asking for is what we're going to, what they're delivering. We're able to test and validate that's exactly what we're looking for. So that way we're able to then, make the payments at the back end.
Yeah, I mean, what do you think are the key reasons that organizations will actually outsource this problem?
It comes down to resourcing. We don't have capabilities. Every organization is built around core capabilities of what their product or what the service they're going to provide. And then they have, around that, they have some capabilities to be able to do it. Every organization has an IT department, for example. They're able to service and operate and run the core basic IT service of that organization. But then when you're going to install SAP, well, then they go to SAP and say, okay, I need you to come in and do it. So we have generalized skills to be able to deliver around certain areas or be able to provide certain services. But then when we require specific capabilities, knowledge, etc., well, then we have to go buy it from an expert. And that's really what I think it comes down to. And the realization of organizations that they can't do everything in-house. We can't afford to keep an SAP team, experts on site. We can't afford to have Workday people on site. We can't afford to have, or any, machinery, automation process. They can't all be on site unless that's core business. And so it's just a realization that, or an organization needs to grow and expand. And as we go through that process, we need to buy specialization outside the organization.
Yeah, so they're using it as extended capacity and extended capability. But in terms of how they manage that, most of those kind of large organizations that you deal with have got fairly mature procurement teams. They've got technology stack in the background. They're buying services. They're using services already. What are the key drivers that you see that will push them towards a situation where they'll go, this problem of managing all these services that we're buying, often hundreds of millions, if not billions per year. What are the key drivers that push them to say, we're going to have to outsource this to somebody?
Yeah, it's a good question, because there's a couple of answers. One is the realization of the risk that's associated with it. Like at the end of the day, you're right, procurement teams are well established, but they're one of the most underfunded organizations funded teams in an organization. They're just incredibly understaffed. So what happens is they are in essence doing bare minimum. So they're making sure that the big things kind of go through okay. They do their due diligence, making sure that the the overarching contracts are in place. But then once it starts getting through down the spend levels, generally, once it starts getting down a little lower, so if we're talking $1 million and below, maybe, they're just transactions going through. They get a very cursory look at, unless somebody raises a point and says, hey, something's not quite right here. they're just being passed through the system. And within those agreements, anything could be written there, so I think it, I don't want to say, but engagement managers, hiring managers, as they're having those conversations with clients, with suppliers, those suppliers could be helping them craft those agreements. They could be inserting anything in there. And so it just opens the door to some element of risk there that really needs to be mitigated. So being able to put it into a technology where you're able to suddenly enforce some rigor around that, whether you are helping with the contract writing process, where you're only allowed certain terms to be able to be entered in, or some terms can never be edited, or etc. So that way there's some rigor and control. The guardrails are in place, so that way you're not exposing yourselves too heavily. There's other, and AI is a great example here, there's a couple of great AI tools on the market at the moment who are really starting to look into those things, and where they're able to build individual client profiles. So and supplier profiles. So they're able to start looking at the individual transactions coming in, butting them up against those profiles, which list out certain behaviors or certain things that they're allowing, spend thresholds, certain terms and conditions being passed through or barred. And so what they're able to do is use AI as providing some of that filter work there to kind of like mitigate that risk again. So I think that, things like AI is going to drive a lot of advantage here, especially on that initial uptake work. So it's around mitigating risk for the organization. Then it's around secondary. I think the other driver is like, we spend a lot of money. Are we really getting the value for that money? And there's a lot of organizations who have great upfront programs in place. They do their project. They justify they need $10 million or $20 million spend. And then they never go back and look at the return on investment to make sure that when we actually invested that money on a program to get something done, we've shifted lives, company budgets, etc., to get things done. We never actually check to see that we're realizing the gain here. So I think one of the things that is figuring out, are we spending our money correctly? Are we spending it in the most efficient manner? Are we, from a processing perspective? And then, as I said, making sure we're actually being smart with how we're spending our money, measuring the return on investment, making sure that we are achieving the goals we're supposed to do. I'm sure there's many organizations you can cite and conversations you've had with all the procurement people you've met in your time, but who have run projects, and they will confess to you that we should have killed this project, or we should have, we said we were going to do this, and after 6 months, we just changed our goals and, delivered it anyway, and we never really got the benefit we were looking for. And I think that's a huge area, I think, of opportunity for all clients to really look and see that we actually get what we're supposed to be getting, and it delivers the value we're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, because as I said earlier, when you're buying a service, it's just less tangible. And I think so visibility is definitely a massive issue. And it's partly an issue of capacity within organizations, within their procurement teams, to manage, particularly, as you said, the tail spend. But just services are just messier. It's also, I believe, partly due to the way that top level kind of generalized procurement technology works, like your kind of big source to pay, procure to pay platforms. They were ultimately born out of an evolution from the ERP to these procurement specific systems, exactly as the moniker describes, procuring to payment, and managing that process. But when they were coming into operation, the market was much more geared towards goods and materials and manufacturing, following on from that kind of ERP journey, than services. And so therefore, when you try and capture services, you try and manage services through those types of systems, it's not the same. It's not as easy. You can't do catalogs quite so easily because every service is potentially different. You can't therefore do guided buying so easily. It's just not as easy to commoditize in that way. So I think where organizations are procuring services, a lot of the time they're going through some sort of a process in varying degrees of process, which will mean that the buyers within the organization are contracting with the suppliers. The level of risk and the level of visibility, as I'm sure you know as well as I do, has a huge variance in that. But even in fairly decent cases, organizations might have the end result might be a statement of work agreement that is a signed PDF scanned copy that's in a file repository somewhere. So it's very, very difficult for anybody to understand when you've got any type of volume what you're buying, and then when you feed that into the delivery, is it measured against with a clear deliverables? Is it measured against those deliverables? You get into all that kind of issue. So I think that visibility piece and the capacity is a significant element as to why I see companies outsourcing it. But also I think there's an element of freedom in outsourcing it as well, in a weird way, in the sense that you can kind of, if you're trying to do it internally, you've got all these hurdles of how different departments are doing things and the existing systems in place. If you can pass the problem out to a third party, if that's the right situation for your organization, you are getting away from some hurdles in that sense. You can give it to them. They can use a piece of technology that's going to have to interface with what you're doing elsewhere, but it kind of takes it out of the loop a little bit. So I feel like there's some value in the change management elements of that and the freedom around using different technology that's specifically designed to manage that process, that gives an advantage to the third party to then be able to say, we're going to do this start to finish, and we're going to make it scalable so that you can actually see what's happening, rather than, I feel like most organizations are working at a PO level, that they're understanding how much they're spending with who, but they don't really know what they're doing, or like you say, what they're getting for it.
I think, no, you're right. It goes back to, what was it, Ronald Reagan's old thing, trust but verify. I think what we do is we trust a lot, and we never do the verify component. And is a little bit worrying. We run very successful organizations. They do great things in the marketplace in different industries. We do we're market leaders in doing things, yet we don't have that basic control around whether we're actually getting the value. And I think you're right about I think it's part of the evolution of business in general. Like, as we've devolved responsibility down the work stack, as it were, to get it close as possible to the coalface, so that way the people who are experts, they're the ones driving decisions, which I think is very valuable. But in doing so, I think you're right, those ERP systems of old, they're become more historical tools. Then we're able to see what I did last month or the month before or whatever it is. And whereas I see things like VMSs and that, where you're actually capturing the process real time, it's up front, and you're able to start to see and be able to go, okay, I can influence that buy. I can see that we've purchased 15 times with company X, and we should look at that relationship with company X and say, that's more strategic value to us because we do buy so much from you. So instead of doing onesie twosies, let's sit down and talk about how we can get better value for us. If we can commit to maybe doing 30 transactions with you a year, well, then we'll be able to get better, commercial terms around what these arrangements would be. And I think that's one of the benefits, I think, is what you're talking about, is this more strategic sourcing element away from the transactional. And let's start looking at how we actually do the buy, how we actually shaping those interactions with our key suppliers, and making sure we're using them in the right place, and then looking at them also to make sure they're delivering the right value to us, and whether it's the transaction or the commercial value around that transaction. So I think you're 100% correct, but I think it's an element of multiple things. But one of them I think is missing is, like, we've devolved all that responsibility down, and we haven't necessarily bought the tools with it to be able to support it. And this is where I see organizations like yourselves who build these VMSs, who are able to capture all that sourcing component and be able to provide that visibility information back in real time to an organization to be able to influence that buy. Whereas traditionally it was like, hey, I've got a report, a month ago I bought this, hey, we could have done better, next time we'll do better. If you tell me next time we'll do better, And that's where, yeah. So I think you're right. It's like getting access to real-time data that's actually going to be useful in making decisions.
Yeah, I mean, you've got the real-time element of it that is basically giving you warning of stuff going wrong, and just facilitating that supply relationship management throughout the life of a project. You know, you're getting early visibility of cost overruns. You're seeing where things are going wrong. You're getting an understanding where internal teams are holding up the supplier, where otherwise the supplier might get blamed. But you're assessing poor supplier performance when they're under delivering in real time. I mean, for us, we always look at, in our system, for example, we've got some really cool AI stuff around supplier performance management, where you can look at quantitative metrics versus qualitative scoring on suppliers on every project and every milestone. So you can compare suppliers within categories, across categories. You can compare overall supplier scores. It's incredibly useful. I kind of see that as like the holy grail, but it is quite advanced in the sense that to get to that, you've got to nail the process in the first place. You've got to be able to capture the information in the first place. And that's where, for a lot of organizations, they can't do that because they're trying to operate through these very large kind of top level procurement suites that are not designed to deal with the granularity and the flexibility of services procurement. And the teams don't have the capacity to be able to get all over this spend and put the processes in place and manage it all. Whereas you give it to a third party and go, all right, find a technology solution and come up with a plan and explain to me how we're going to get value out of this and return on investment. You're giving the problem to someone else to say, we haven't got time to do this, but the net result of us doing it is going to be X times more than the amount it's going to cost us to do it.
I think, yeah, you're 100% correct. I think an element there that we should add is the actual engagement managers, there's hiring managers in that. I hired Mick to be writing code. Then all of a sudden, Mick is now negotiating some projects and things like that with, and so I'm not necessarily skilled in being able to do that. And so what we do is, I think, by putting these tools in place, we put some rigor and boundaries around those things to make sure that the person is able to get the right level of support, help, the MSP puts the right people in place, they're able to coach and guide and educate. So that way they can be more educated buyers and they can figure out how to do things a little bit better within the company guidelines. It's never going to be perfect, but it is going to be a massive improvement because to your point, you're going to end up with better quality contracts, engagements, which end up driving much better value at the end. So I think there's an element in there, and that's where I like the idea of the tools to really drive that rigor, like smart tools with AI and all that, work around that to make sure that we're collecting the right information at the right time. I think it's going to be incredibly valuable. One of the key metrics, though, I think is in any organization as you implement these programs is when does the hiring manager start to decline payment? There's, and I'm sure you've experienced this as well, is what happens is an organization, a hiring manager engages an organization, they're delivering something, it's supposed to be delivered on, I don't know, July 1. And what happens is, just before 30th of June kind of pops up, they're reaching out saying, we're going to be late. We're going to be delivering late because it's not working. It's doing this. I need more information, whatever it is. And it starts to push out. And eventually they deliver on, I don't know, July 10th or something. After that engagement manager has spent a lot of time coaching them, helping them, filling in the gaps, making sure they understand what's going on, maybe doing some, they get a pre-release to test, to do whatever it is. But it ends up being delivered effectively 2 weeks late. Then when it comes through for payment, those hiring managers go, click, we'll pay now. Even though they missed the deadline and they might have contracts written where they even have penalties and things like that, they won't enforce the penalty. They'll just go, click, I'll pay now. It's okay. And when you go back using the tools like you have, what you're able to do is then ask those hiring managers why, were they good to work with? And they'll give you the feedback that, hey, they're okay, but I had to do a lot of work, a lot more than I actually envisaged I needed to do to actually get the product over the line. And they ended up delivering a little bit late, but it's functionally, it's kind of okay. And then the follow-up question is, well, we're paying for them to delight you. Was it perfect? Was it close? Was it thing? And they go, yeah, it was okay. It has a few things. It's okay. So it might or might not have met the quality requirements, but we accepted it anyway. And then we've paid them on time. And the question is, well, why did you pay them on time? They go, but we have an agreement. It has a contract that says on this date, I need to pay you. And you're going, well, also in that contract is that if you don't deliver what you're supposed to be getting and of the sufficient quality on time, etc., you don't have to pay. Like there's function or there's clauses in that agreement that help you manage through that sort of process. And by not engaging, they get to a point they just agree. So by not engaging the procurement team, by not engaging or having any systems in place where you're able to track that kind of process and do that, you're not really going to be able to educate the engagement manager or hiring manager on how that buying process should work. We're kind of like just throwing them out there and just said, hey, good luck, best of it. Here's, the high level of how you're actually going to purchase and manage through. So we don't really help them in that. Two, we're not really helping our supplier understand that when we go into a contract, we agree that these are the terms and you need to hit those terms for you to get paid, and we don't hold them accountable for that sort of thing. And three, we're not, we're pushing out or absorbing all that extra cost, and whether it's, it might push our product release into the market an extra month or extra 2 months or whatever it is. So we absorb that revenue loss just because we're trying to be nice people to everyone. And so we're going to learn to, now that we have these tools in place and we're collecting this information, to manage those tools and manage to what those agreements are. Like if we're going to spend all that time, upfront negotiating those things, we're going to stand by it. And I think that, that really takes like a 12 to 18 month kind of cycle for organizations to shift their culture a little bit, to say, excuse me, although I'm partnering with you as a supplier, partnering with you doesn't mean I just accept everything you say. It's like I have goals and objectives I need to achieve, and I need to manage you accordingly. And here's my rules of engagement, and we need to stick with those things. So I think it takes a little bit of time for that to kick in as well. But once that kicks in, well, then, we suddenly have all those engagement managers who are driving this increased value into the organization. And that's enormous value to the overall organization. We can pick up, I hazard a guess, we're probably going to pick up at least a 5 to 10% gain if we just suddenly stop that kind of playing by the nice guy rules, but play by the rules that we agreed to.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an area has huge potential, but when you look at the buying and delivery cycle, from procuring, contract, delivery of services, there are so many steps where there's so much potential for value to be added all along the way, even if it's just driving a more competitive process where people are just direct awarding stuff to the same suppliers all the time, maybe because all of their suppliers aren't easily visible across the organization, where if they're centralized through an outsourced provision in a piece of technology, it's easier for them to see what's available, and procurement can help guide them, or there can be scoring on what's supplier A's average cost overrun versus supplier B, all these sorts of things. But also in the upfront process of actually defining what's going to be delivered. Like quite often you're getting kind of suppliers potentially marking their own homework or creating bids that are a self-fulfilling prophecy that are automatically just going to end up going to them. And that's an area where it's really interesting to see some of the stuff going on with AI, with these large language models, where it's basically pulling together. We've done stuff around scoping with ChatGPT, and I think there's just huge potential in that area to help people kind of create requirements more effectively, and end up with a place to start and things to refine. And obviously procurement can get involved in that process more if what's happening is going through a systemized process, where maybe if it's above a 50k buy, it then has to go through some sort of review where someone in procurement just gets notified and just looks at a requirement and says, well, you've kind of covered these main areas. Yeah, that's great. Off you go. Or they maybe give a bit of advice on structure and content. But that can be done. AI can help with that. So there are lots of these kind of value points all the way through the process. And it's like, if you start in the right way, you build up this value. It aggregates all the way through to that holy grail of ultimately being able to say, when we're doing these types of projects, these are the suppliers we should be thinking about. or typically when in this particular area of the business, we're always getting cost overruns, or we've got this big supplier that's got a great relationship with the C-suite. They do loads of good stuff for us in finance, but we're spending tens of millions a year with them in marketing. Why is that? We've got these other suppliers that are doing a better job in marketing. Why is that spend just going over there? So it allows a lean procurement team, which as you mentioned earlier, most procurement teams are extremely lean. It allows them to manage the strategic element of a much greater volume of spend because they've got a system effectively doing the legwork and hopefully making life easier for the buyers, the hiring managers, the buying managers, and the suppliers at the same time by automating those interactions, and just giving them control and process. And then you guys kind of pass them back a lot of information, which they can then use strategically. And I think that's where the market needs to get to. But for a lot of organizations, they're kind of at square one when it comes to services procurement, in the sense that there's a lot of stuff going on. Apart from some really top level big suppliers doing strategic stuff, it's just impossible for them to keep on top of it because it's not in a system and it's just all happening too fast and it's too complicated.
And it's, you're right, like there's a lot of activity, this huge amount of activity. It's got to happen yesterday. There's a lot of pressure, a lot of visibility, and yeah, it just gets swamped. So I think you're 100% correct. And like, this is where I think there's a really good place for MSPs here, where they provide their staffing solution, or their team solution has to have procurement support. Like, they really need to have procurement professionals in there. They're actually experienced and understand how that buying process works. They're able to kind of leap in a little bit. And especially I would, propose that during that first 6, 12, 18-month period, that they take a real hands-on approach and really supplement that procurement team, internal procurement team, to make sure that they've got the support they need, the initial bandwidth, so they're able to kind of work through this process and kind of evolve that solution for them. I can't stress enough that, the time, like you've hit upon it, like it really is like the time, the load, the burden to get all these things done. Every organization wants their stuff done immediately. The internal approvals are just seen as overhead. I've done my deal. I've talked to my supplier and it can get done. And I appreciate that as a significant thing, finding the person who's actually going to deliver on it. But then the internal processing to get approvals and to get the people on site to do that, that's seen as overhead, and that's a burden. And it's not, it's not being positioned correctly. It really is not just approval, it's authority to spend the money. Is it the right spend? Are we doing all our checks and balances, to your point, making sure the right suppliers are being used, making sure the value in the contracts there, whether it's commercial or whether, the terms are actually going to be favorable long-term? Is it with is it time for, is the schedule of the actual deliverable going to meet with the organizational goals, etc.? All those things need to be taken into account and done. It's not just, hey, I've gone and talked to Joe Blow, he took me to lunch and it's a great deal and I'm going ahead. There's a lot of work, and that rigor needs to be there. It really does. But to your point, there's a lot of opportunity. We're using the tools. AI's, I'm a convert on the thing that AI is going to help with a lot of that low level. It's not going to give you, the total solution. That needs oversight and everything around it. But it is going to be able to take out that low level, that first cut, where we're able to build contracts, make sure the right conditions are in place, making sure that every benefit that you're looking for is in, every benefit or everything that you want ruled out is out. All those sort of things, all that transactional stuff that we need eyes at the moment to look at, it's going to help in that tremendously. And maybe we can turn that, the turnaround time from writing the original agreement to signed off. You always hear the people, I can get it done in 4 hours. I can walk it around the office and get it all done. Well, tremendous. But I think if we can get it done in probably a couple of days on average, then we're doing a fantastic job.
100%. I mean, anecdotal feedback that I've already heard about is, if you're using the right tool to help support your scope creation, that would then fit into probably standardized SOW terms, but the scope creation, using the right tools, and this is something that is why we're doing what we're doing with AI in this area. You're talking reducing it from like 3 months to 3 days in terms of that's just that turnaround time of actually getting the scope together, because procrastination, you've got to get down to it, you're starting with nothing, it's just like all these things to think about, you put it off, it's on email, you go around the houses, you might ask somebody for if you've got somewhere to start and you've got the right structure. But the key with working with AI is being able to use it in an informed manner, in the sense that these tools to a certain extent are kind of general, and in some ways they're kind of a bit dumb. They can process very large amounts of information, but you need to tell them how you want them to process it. So that, I think, is the magic. It really is in how you utilize these tools to make the user experience the best it possibly can be for that very specific use case. And I think when you look at how lean procurement teams are and how much of the 20 trillion in spend, that's a lot of transactions, that's a lot of stuff going on. If you can automate some of that and just make it quicker and simpler for people, then it just allows, where the big gap is in services, procurement of services versus procurement of goods, is as you say, ultimately it's about realizing value. And if you can streamline some of these things, then procurement teams can focus much more on what's our relationship like with the supplier, why are we missing delivery in some of these areas, are our choices the right choices, and really look forward and actually do things like horizon planning, strategically the next 12 months. Imagine that.
That's scary.
Yeah, next 12 months, we're going to have these types of projects coming up. We've got supplier capacity and capability in these areas. We've got some great partner suppliers, but actually we're going to have we've got new areas coming out, new products, new changes to legislation, new changes to technology. So we need to expand our supply chain. There's so much potential, but that potential can only be realized when the basics are done correctly, which is where I think a lot of companies are, not through any fault of their own. And some organizations ultimately are going to take this challenge on themselves and say, we'll do it internally. We're gonna buy in our own systems. We're going to build our own processes, and that's our decision. Whereas, as you say, other organizations are going to look at this and go, we've got a real problem here, but we just don't have the time or capacity or the kind of freedom around technology to be able to just sort this out. It's too complicated. One of the questions I had for you was, do you find that from an MSP perspective, are clients coming to you with these problems, or is it more about kind of going out to them and educating them, or is it a bit of a mix?
It's a bit of a mix. Like there's definitely clients who are in the boat of, they realize they have a problem, an opportunity that they need to work on. So some of them do come, they're very clear in what, we have a problem with. We need better throughput. We're not receiving our value. It's a bit of a black hole. We kind of think we're okay, but we don't know. And that drives the conversation, the fear of the unknown. And you can see it when, you start getting to the next stage and you're going, okay, well, can you share some information? And then it might take 2-3 weeks for an organization to be able to pull together what their spend data is. And which I understand, like if they were able to press a button and get it, they would have a pretty good system in play, and we probably talk to them about how they actually operate. But it really is, they don't have everything, that data available to them freely. It comes from disparate systems. They have to put it all together, and then when they put it together, they don't know what it means. Like, they can't figure stuff out, and it's just not through any lack of desire or anything else. It's too hard. It's really difficult for them to do. So we get a lot of those kind of conversations, but there are ones where we knock on the door and we're talking to people and just highlighting these things, and they're going, oh, really? But, we think we have it okay. And when you're talking a little bit more, you're able to kind of hit a few buttons on the point where they might realize, well, maybe we do have a gap here, and be able to talk to them. But generally, a lot of organizations kind of know there's a gap there. It's a known gap. It's, but it's a, they ride the risk, as it were. Like they know that they're okay. We're tracking all these other things. And so we're all, we're not in too bad a shape, but we're really turning away money at that point. Like instead of just going, we're okay, we're actually instead of turning this from a negative, we can turn it into a positive. We can use it as a lever for that organization to really improve what their bottom line looks like. And to your point, stabilize on suppliers. I like your key point really, or your comment before about the suppliers and knowing who the suppliers are going to be in your pool, who are your preferred suppliers, etc., and knowing their capabilities and being able to advertise that into the organization is really key. Like rather than having people wasting time reaching, dialing, searching the web, trying to find all these people, let's use the capabilities of MSPs and what's in the VMS, etc. And we're collecting all that data. Let's look at how we're actually processing that and how we grade those organizations and be able to pick them out and figure out exactly how we're going to deal with it. There's, you don't necessarily, even if I've seen organizations focus on particular suppliers because they like what their objective is going to be, whether they are developing a new IP, whether they want to partner with them and actually funnel and work, knowing that, yeah, they might not be the cheapest, but we want to grow this because we know strategically in 6 months, 12 months, that's who we want to be going with. And we want to partner with them and feed them to make sure that they're going to develop to our requirements. And so there's organizations, like you're able to track through that process and make sure you identify those organizations. The same with, diversity, equity organizations, you're tagging those, how you're actually feeding work to them rather than, just maybe looking at numbers or going out and searching for doing things, being able to cultivate those suppliers and making sure they're going to fit your future needs. So you can actually identify and feed the things through them. So I think a lot of that, again, goes back to collecting the information, which you talked about, and it's like collecting the data, figuring out what that is, and then feeding it back. So that way people are able to start making informed decisions about how they want to operate their business.
Yeah, definitely. I think, the organization, I personally, from my own experience of talking to CPOs, procurement, all sorts of different people in procurement teams within all sorts of different organizations globally, anybody who buys services, I'd say I've virtually never come across anybody who's actually got this button down. How important it is for them as an organization right now is a different thing. Whether they recognize it as a problem is a different thing. A lot of organizations will say we're happy working to budget. So as long as a PO matches up with a payment, we're not worrying about that at the moment. But they are ignoring billions in basically potential cost savings. And some organizations that don't think they've got a problem, it's kind of they don't know what they don't know. They've never delved into it. They just think it's too difficult. It's not even something that some organizations would consider as an option to get on top of it because it's too complicated. We can't even be thinking about that right now. But another question I was going to ask you was, so whether it's an organization approaching an MSP or vice versa, there's this interesting positioning where you've got, say, for example, you've got an existing relationship. The MSP might be delivering services around contingent workforce. Okay, clearly a core area of expertise for MSP organizations is kind of, their bread and butter where they've originated from. So within that client organization, there are going to be potentially, it might be like a contingent workforce category manager, or it might be, an HR and talent function that are dealing specifically with that MSP. I always find it interesting in terms of how that works. When it spreads out to services, you clearly need to have the right interface within the MSP, i.e. somebody like yourself who has expertise specifically in services procurement. You're buying outputs from an organization rather than buying an individual's time. It's very different, as we discussed earlier. But you also potentially are going to have a different interface within that client organization. It could be, I don't know, somebody who's coordinating everything like a procurement excellence or center of excellence type lead, or it could be a senior category manager, or it could be maybe even a chief procurement officer. But how does that work in terms of that balance of like the different stakeholders that have expertise within, say, contingent workforce and services procurement within both the MSP and the client organization? How does that kind of marry up?
So I think you're right. There are different skill set. Like there are a procurement skill set as opposed to a recruiting skill set, and so they meet in a different way into the client organization. You're right. The services procurement is more of a business to business transaction kind of relationship rather than a hiring manager to an individual. So it's a business to business function, and that usually takes place at a slightly higher level within the organization. So what I used to always favor is in the procurement team, they're category managers. They understand how the process works. They understand how that purchasing process, kind of just the transactional nature of it, works. But what they're able to do then is be able to communicate in the terms with the procurement team. Like it's more focused towards procurement, less to hiring managers. Their hiring managers provide the content and the detail for whatever the transaction is going to be, but then they deal more with a centralized procurement function to make sure that that transaction gets formulated correctly and then executed correctly. So it takes place, slightly elevated kind of positioning. The reporting and all the detailed processing around that is slightly different. Again, it's less, around the price point kind of conversation. Obviously we have all detail around what the commercial value of the program of the activity is going to be, but we're reporting in, to your point, around what the forecast is on it, because they are able to start doing projected spend kind of models out, or how that kind of looks. You're able to start forecasting out a little bit more robustly, and you're able to start doing a lot of that projection work. And so I find that procurement leads are much more interested in that kind of information about where they're going and who they're spending with. So they're able to then start looking at the internal contractual relationships they have with suppliers and start to look at those as activities rather than the transactional component of that. So it's a different kind of relationship, fundamentally doing the same thing, but it is a little bit different with a different internal clientele that they have to deal with. Does that make sense?
It does, because MSPs are problem solvers. MSPs are solving problems. They're good at putting a process in place, using the right technology to enable a solution that is a people and technology solution that takes a problem and comes back with an outcome that drives value. So whether you're applying that to management of contingent workforce, or whether you're applying that to management of services procurement, it's the same thing, but slightly different processes, different things to consider, different legal issues, and different expertise. But ultimately, it's still a similar problem-solving exercise. One of the things that I find interesting is what I see as like a lack of uniformity within the industry, in the sense that, firstly, if you look at services procurement from the context of an MSP, if you and I are talking about that, it could be procurement of IT services, it could be legal, it could be marketing. It potentially, in some cases, could be like construction services, or even works within a construction program. Is so diverse when you look at across the public sector, across the private sector. But organizations, when they outsource it, they'll in their heads that it's services procurement that they're outsourcing. But when they're thinking about it internally, I don't think they think about it in the same way. Who owns services procurement within an organization? It's across 5-10 different categories, and it's not like one person's problem with the organization. So I always wonder, I tend to see a lack of uniformity in which stakeholder. It's not like it's going to be the same stakeholder in every organization that's coming to you with this problem, or you're liaising with.
Right. Yeah. Like I try to bifurcate that process a little bit, and the buying process itself is pretty similar kind of process. We have requirement, how you're going to fulfill it, what it's going to be, how much it's going to cost me, when it's going to be delivered, and then the execution of it. So that contractual kind of process is kind of pretty uniform. The actual deliverable itself, and you're right, it could be I'm building a website, I'm building a building, I'm doing landscaping, whatever it is, they're all different. And so though that detail captured into the contract is really around the work that's going to be done, but the actual framework around it is not overly different. And I think sometimes that gets blurred a little bit, where people focus, hey, I'm cutting down my trees, so therefore that's going to be done this way and it has to have everything. But the actual buying, the contract in place can be kind of standardized a little bit around that. So it's not that big a difference. There is a difference without doubt, but it's really around, not the framework of the agreement, but the details within that agreement. So I think sometimes it gets, overloaded a little bit. It's, because it is dealing with different topics, and so therefore it must be different. But I think sometimes that gets a little bit kind of skewed. Second of all, is I like to think of the procurement team. I always go back and use the phrase smart hands. These aren't people who are just going to be transaction processing. They really can't be just, hey, here's a rec, I'm just putting it through the system and doing it. These have to be people who are knowledgeable in procurement process. They understand the category management type people, so they are able to really appreciate the process going through. They're able to pick up all those issues or hiccups when they do QAs on those transactions themselves, or when they're looking at negotiation frameworks and everything else. They're able to kind of pick out things that are important. And this goes back to, again, our comment from much earlier was around organizations don't have that capacity. They don't have those people in play at the moment. Everyone would love to be able to do that within their team, but the procurement team is only of a set size. They're getting a whole lot of work being pushed towards them. They don't have the ability to scan and look at all these things and give them the due diligence. So they use a risk-based approach where they go, we'll look at the higher ones, the lower ones, we'll just pass them through, give them a cursory look. And by engaging with the MSP, with these smart hands, folks, they're able to kind of look at things and be able to augment the procurement team in their function and be able to capture a lot more and also drive a lot more rigor into the system, and also use it as a process for educating the engagement management, the hiring manager, around how they should be constructing things, because it is a long-term process to change the culture of an organization. It is at 12 months, 18 months buying. So they stop doing what they're doing and start operating within the guidelines of what their organizational purchasing policies are.
Yeah, exactly. I think the as I said, the stakeholder thing is interesting in the sense that I guess it could be a category manager coming to an MSP, it could be a head of procurement, it could be a CPO potentially. But it's clearly a procurement problem, which depending on how the organization's set up might be very separate from the people dealing with contingent workforce, or actually it might be very closely aligned, or it could in some cases even be similar teams. What would you say is the harder side of the process to solve? So if we look at it as kind of like pre-contract, post-contract, what in your experience is the harder part of that equation to solve in terms of putting the right processes in place and getting on top of it?
I think the contract, I think we're lucky. There's some really good platforms out there that we can leverage that are able to, like your own, is able to, once the data gets into it, it enables, provides visibility. You're able to see what it is, and you're able to put controls in place to make sure everything works. So I think being able to leverage that, the technology is really fundamental to any success. I think anything that happens outside the technology causes us grief. That's where we start to get in trouble. That's where we start to find that, people are negotiating deals, they're doing things, they're making offers around stuff that, it just can't be supported by the organization. So a lot of that pre-work causes us problems. So I always take the position, if I can get it into the tool, a tool into that process, well, then I can have success from there because I can drive that rigor and control. Outside that, I'm like, all I'm doing is just picking up the phone, advising, hey, Johnny, you should not be doing this. Or have you thought about using another supplier or doing things? So the only way around that is education and constant outreach to really try to make sure that the engagement managers understand how they should be purchasing, what are the options that are available to them. But once it gets into the tool, like, then we can drive rigor and control. So yeah, like it seems like a little bit of a cop out, but I apologize. But
no, it makes sense. It makes sense. I mean, like you say,
that's the tool drives the rigor. That's that's the enforcement, and making sure that the VMS is able to support that buying, like it's set up correctly. It really is catered towards what that organization needs, and we have the right checks and balances in place there. Well, then that, dare I say, gets easier. Like,
so it's setting up the processes in the first place, making sure all the pre-work. That's where the pre-planning, the change management really comes into play, and a lot of the people side element of what the MSP is providing and how they're helping that organization shape those processes and roll those processes out. Because as you say, once you've got it into the tool, that's what those tools are designed for, designed to control the process, capture the information, so you can then utilize that. It's kind of like I said, in some ways, it's the further you get down the process, the more it is reliant on the previous steps. So you got to start in the right way. So yeah, I think it's a good point there that there's less control. One thing that quite often still comes up, and I see this as partly a symptom of the fact that sometimes services procurement programs that are given to MSPs can be very kind of closely positioned to contingent workforce. So they might be like almost a little bit of gray area where it's not necessarily like giant IT projects. It might be independent, consultancies, small consultancies or small consultants that are providing these services. And in those cases, or in some cases within MSP programs, worker tracking is something that is very heavily focused on. If I take a bigger view of procurement across complex services categories, I feel like that diminishes in importance because it's all about getting an outcome from an organization. But I just wondered what your thoughts were in terms of the importance of worker tracking and why that's important.
Yeah, so no, it's incredibly important for a couple of reasons. Just from a risk mitigation, it's really important. Just knowing who's on your network, who's touching, doing, who's doing what to where to whom, sort of thing. I think that that really came to the fore. I remember talking about this a couple of years ago, and it really got, people would just kind of nod nicely and move on. But then when COVID hit and everyone suddenly went on remote work and they were trying to figure out what's going on, suddenly it really drove home the point that we need to know where everyone is, what they're doing, how they're connected to our networks, what do we got, how do we structure our work, what risks do we have, etc. So it really kind of, if there's a positive that came out of COVID, well then it really did highlight the fact that we need to have better controls around how it is, who's on doing touching our network and how that kind of all works out. Then I like to also, as a side thing, is I like to track time, because whether I'm billing against time or not, I've proposed to different clients at times is we can even have statement of work, milestone activities, but we have non-billable timesheets. So that way is you're able to kind of like figure out what's the level of effort for people to do, like they're putting in 9 hours, 9 hours, 9 hours. And then you're able to kind of back in and say, okay, well then our cost kind of is right on what our overall cost of that project is. We're kind of able to factor in and see that we're kind of getting the value we're looking for. And so I think it's really important to kind of, from a back in the napkin kind of calculation, it'd be really good to get that information. You're able to start work out loading that you can then start to use in future projects. If something similar comes up, you go able to look at and go, oh, look, it's 500 hours of this took to do this. Well, then, it's comparable effort. So you can kind of like do your own budget kind of calculations and make sure you're right. But I like to track workers, just time and making sure who's doing what. I appreciate the fact that, there's organizations and projects where that's not applicable, but it's kind of horses for courses, like if I'm on a project that, had 2,000 workers on it, I'm pretty sure, like that might go by the wayside, being able to get them to track time. But, you never know. It depends on how important it is to the organization, how important that project's going to be, and how important it is to you to really know that the value is being delivered.
Yeah, it's a really interesting area, and you make two very good points there. Absolutely, there's the risk, data compliance, IT security side of things, of knowing, you know, um, who are the individuals that are interacting with our systems, our intranet, etc., entering our buildings, all that sort of stuff. And then there's also this concept of who's on the pitch in everything that we're doing, who's on the pitch representing our organization, working on behalf of other people for our organization, etc. Particularly with the kind of worker regulations side of things as well, keeping an eye on that compliance. But that's an interesting point you made about the kind of worker tracking background sanity check, in the sense of, organizations ultimately want to look at a piece of work that needs to be done and say, what's the most effective way for us to do this? Do we have the internal capacity? Do we have the internal capability? If so, is it more effective to do it that way? Or is it going to be more cost effective to get a contractor in? How much is that going to work out? And or if we get it done as an outsourced outcome-based project, okay, we might be paying a bit more, but there should be less chance of it taking longer than we expect, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's a really interesting one. But this is where it comes down to it. Companies are spending hundreds of millions, billions on this per year, on services per year. Once they start getting the data, they can start looking at things like this using, numerical based decision making to really, really improve what they're spending. And it's, a chief procurement officer is in a very difficult position if they're under pressure to cut costs, and they're looking at services and they've got no visibility. They're just going to have to say cut costs in these areas, but they don't know what they're getting in those areas. So they could be cutting off stuff that's amazing consulting advice that's really driving their bottom line or helping them launch new products. And if they can't see that, they could be cutting off their nose to spite their face.
Yep. No, and unfortunately it happens. Like, organizations kind of make those decisions. It's the kind of profit versus growth type scenarios are kind of there. I'm not saying it's black or white, but they shift that needle a little bit one way over the other. And so you're right, they come in and they go, hey, we need a 5% saving, and we'll just take a 5% cut, across the board, and every supplier is going to be 5% cheaper. And you're going, well, that doesn't quite work out, because we have no data to measure it. And I, like, to your point though, you were just making, is like, I really think the procurement team, if MSPs are able to turn up, they turn up with the tools, the right tool, the right VMS that's installed and done. What you're able to do is make sure that we're collecting the right data. It becomes real actionable information for the procurement team to do things. So they stop looking at hey, I've bought 6 widgets or something this month and it's with 3 suppliers. That work's already done for them. It's leveraging the power of the technology to be able to deliver on those things. You're able to see all those things. All of a sudden, then the procurement team is starting to make those more strategic decisions about, like, how to manage the business. And this is where it becomes a real lever. Like, we're trying to position the organization for sale. So do we shift to be more profit than overgrowth at the moment? So that way our balance sheet looks a little bit better. So how do we do that? And they're able to be more strategic in some of those conversations. So I really think there's power in making sure, to your point, getting that technology in place, capturing that information, relieving the procurement team from the rote tasks, that transactional stuff, and then enabling them to really start kind of look at the strategic direction of the organization. Procurement's not necessarily, it's about buying, but it's about buying in a strategic manner and using that as a strategic lever for the organization, rather than just a transaction of getting something through the door.
Yeah, and procurement are so central to the way an organization functions, even though it's a relatively young business function.
Yep.
And penetration into areas like marketing, for example, came later. They're at the center of so much information. They touch so many different departments, and they're dealing with what's happening inside the business and what's happening outside the business and how the two are interacting. So it's a very pivotal position. So one of the things I was going to ask you was about just how you've seen the kind of MSP programs in services procurement specifically change over time. and whether you feel that there are any opportunities that are being missed currently, or kind of where it's going to get to. So just in that kind of transition, where do you think we are in that cycle? What's changed since you've been involved with it?
Well, I think that, yeah, it's an interesting question. There's a lot of transition away. First of all, it was about just get data, do transactions, etc., and it became very routine. And so what we're doing, I think, and now as an industry, is really trying to get up into that upstream space, helping with the sourcing, helping with that, because people realize that's really where the goal is, or the gold is. That's really where you can influence the actual transaction. You can start to put behaviors in place that are really going to help with not just the current buyer, but future buyers, helping educate, do things, and start to really drive some much more valuable interactions with suppliers. So I think a lot of people are now starting to look at that. The once the contract's done, that's very transactional. So they're all starting to see that, that's just routine tasking and do it. I see that the future of MSP being a little bit comes down to that smart hands and partnership. I see it being much more closer ingrained with the procurement organization. I think that there's going to be less emphasis on the transactional, because that's already in place. It's like, how do we really partner with you? How do we really start driving some of those more important decisions, as we're talking about just before? How do we figure out how to use the procurement as a true lever? How do we, based on what your organizational objectives are for this year, next year, 5-year plan, how do we shape your buying practices? How are we going to help the organization get to those goals? So I think it more of a strategic kind of shift, as the Accentures of the world and KPMG and all that are already in that space. That's where that's their bread and butter. They're like, how do they help with the strategic direction and guide and do things? And I think that's where the MSPs and some of the technology is going to start pushing into. I think that's the next space. I think it's going to be a closing of that gap a lot between what those organizations do and the traditional MSP suppliers do. I think it's going to work.
Like a two-way movement in some of this stuff, isn't there? When you've got the big consultancies getting close to what the MSPs do, and likewise. Yeah. I think the comment you made earlier about services procurement being a big nut to crack. It's a multifaceted nut, and it is very large, massive spend, very complicated, and I think in some cases the barrier for organizations is where the bar is too high, in the sense that if a program, and this is where just kind of interested to get your take on where there are any potentially missed opportunities, because I feel like there are potentially missed opportunities for MSPs where you're not dealing with a $1 billion program, but you might be dealing with a significant program opportunity, but the organization isn't ready to just kind of like eat the whole whale at once. And it feels like sometimes there's a bit of a barrier to entry for organizations, where it's like, if you're going to do it, the complexity in doing it and the cost in doing it is going to be so high that you're going to have to get massive buy-in, and it's going to have to cover a massive proportion of your spend for it to be a viable thing to do. Is that ever frustrating? Do you agree with that, firstly?
I agree with it totally. I think excuse me, I think the whole trust me, like come in with a nice glossy and here it is and all the numbers look great, trust me on this thing, it only goes so far. At the end of the day, the proof's in the pudding, and this is where some of the organization, some of the VMS suppliers, and you're one of them, I think have really identified this gap. And so what you're able to do is it's kind of almost a try before you buy type approach kind of thing. You're able to see what the value is, be able to get in, use the tool early. I know, I've pitched this a number of times, and it gets a lot of interest from high end all the way down to small organizations, is around how do we prove it? How do we demonstrate that what we say is what it's going to be? And you need to, MSPs, I feel, need to really step up in this space and kind of like prove it somehow. And I think there's huge opportunity to be able to kind of like demonstrate that sort of thing, being able to like, let's put a handful of transactions or one transaction through. So the barrier to entry, we have to figure out how to really drop that. So that way we can kind of set something up, push it through the system. They're able to see how it kind of works, push a couple through. They can get like 5, 6 transactions through the system. They're able to see how the process works. What is going to be the saving for them on just an efficiency gain, and then be able to then build upon that, and say, okay, once we have this, you have confidence we can do that. Well, then let's take the next step. And I think the progression is really like we show our operational capabilities, then we start helping you with the sourcing and we start building into that strategic side. So then eventually we end up having the more meaningful conversations as we talked about earlier. But I really think that's the gap. Like that is the way to get in. That's the way to really help to show that it's not just pretty words and everything else. Like there's real meat behind what we're actually selling. There is real value in it. So I think that's, it wouldn't surprise me if you see a lot of organizations kind of shifting to this model in the next probably 12 months. 18 months across the board. It becomes quite standard where you get to try a little bit and see how it kind of works. I know it's a lot of work, especially when some of the big end town VMSs say it's 14 weeks or 18 weeks or whatever it is to do set up and install. Yeah, I think the market's going to push that. So that way, that's going to have to change because, nobody wants to wait 18 weeks and bet the house on something and then have to back out of it. What they need to be able to do is sample it, test it works. It's the whole agile type approach.
Yeah.
You got to test, try, validate, make sure it all kind of builds and works. And I think that's going to be the opportunity moving forward for the next, like I said, 12, 18 months.
Yeah, really interesting one. Another area I'd be interested just to get your take on. It might be kind of an interesting one to kind of wrap things up a little bit, really. But within some MSPs, their function around providing services procurement MSP has been around a few years. And there's certain things that are established, and it will have grown out of the demand, and it will have started in a very transactional manner. As you say, the aim is to move it towards a more strategic delivery type approach. But if you could kind of rewind with all of the information that you have now, if you're coming into an MSP and they're setting up kind of adding services procurement to their portfolio, what would you say were the lessons that you've learned along the way that would maybe make that process easier or more effective?
Yeah, that is an interesting question. I think, so I think there's been a couple of missteps in general, and the industry is kind of corrected as they've gone along, but there were a couple of missteps without that. I think on the MSP side, I think the initial kickoff about like, this is just another line of business and we can just add it in without necessarily resourcing it in the right way. I think there was a misstep associated with that. I think the industry shifted now and wanting to be more procurement based, kind of, they recognize that there is a difference. And so it needs a different skill set. So I think that it'd be good if I was going back to day one. I would be starting with procurement people. I'd be definitely starting with, there's value in that try before you buy type approach. I think we probably went in too early, kind of like everyone did. They kind of looked at these things, the numbers you hear, especially like you're throwing 2 billion or 2 trillion around. But everyone, SIA publishes those numbers as well, big number, and everyone got so excited about it, goes, we'll walk in and we'll just take everything. So I think there was a little bit, we bit off way too much early, and it was like, trust us, we know what we're doing. So I think it was if we were able to structure the team correctly with the right skill set, be able to get in and say, okay, let's take those baby steps. Let's take the transaction through. Let's demonstrate that value immediately. And then if we're able to take from contract to invoice process, that's minimal impact to the culture of the organization, how they procure. So we're able to demonstrate value. And then once that was in play, then we could kind of step back up into the value. And I think, like, if I was going, I had my druthers and went back in time and was able to do that, I think that's how I would kind of approach it. But I think we just, it is a different discipline to what is recruiting staff in contingent. And so I think we just kind of misstepped a little bit on bundling it all up together and thinking that it'll be okay. We're really confident of what we do here, and we appreciate that. And everyone understands that. So we can just bolt this on, and everyone will just assume that it's all going to be the same. And I think the uptick, or the lack of uptick proved that just because we're really good at one thing doesn't mean we're necessarily really good at something adjacent to it. And I don't, it's slowly getting traction. There's still huge opportunity, but it is getting traction. People are understanding that. But it was, just because it's adjacent to it doesn't mean necessarily we're really good at it.
I think that's really, really interesting and well-made point there, because you're absolutely right. You need that level of expertise, but also the client organizations need to be able to see a differentiation in the service and the expertise within an organization, because it is different, and you might well be dealing with completely different stakeholders within the business who maybe have never interacted with the MSP before. And the MSP, if it's recruitment people talking to procurement people, that's not going to necessarily work. So the way that this has evolved, the hard work in the way that MSPs have turned their proposition and increased the quality and the focus and things like that, exactly as you say, if you had a magic wand and could go back in time and do all those things straight away, it would probably make a difference. But also, when you mention about kind of the way analysts talk about the market and things like that, it reminds me of the conversation that used to be around the coming together of procurement and HR. And that's an assumption that MSPs, it's all just going to come together under one roof. That's a tricky one for me, because I just look at it and just go, how an organization hires their perm team, for example, even to a lesser extent, but to a certain extent, contractors as well, versus how they interact on a B2B basis is very different.
They're different things. They're aligned, adjacent, but they're very, very different. And I just think we weren't, aware enough, collectively about how it was, whether it was suppliers, clients, MSPs. We just weren't aware of that nuance and how big that gap really was. It's closing, and it's that opportunity is still there, but it is closing, and we're starting to operate in a better space. But I really do think, we're going to do a really good job in the next couple of years on this and really close it. I firmly believe it, because I think a lot of the hard work's been done. We've got our bruises, we've all got our lumps from going through this process. And I think everyone's learned. And so I think also clients are starting to realize that, they need help in this space. They really do. And by MSPs and being able to clearly articulate what they're actually doing there's a lot of gray area about trust us, we can be great. But there's a lot of that kind of gray is now being kind of swept out of the discussion. And so we're being very precise on what we can do and how we can deliver that value. And then we have the data to back up the numbers about, if you do this, it's this percent, do this, it's that percent. So people can kind of really start to plan ahead very confidently, knowing that, what they're getting is what is actually being told to them.
Yeah. So the propositions have evolved, as the technology has evolved as well to support the advancements of those propositions. So, and with things like, AI coming into the market as well, it's changing things even more. So I think all of these things are coming together to make these offerings much more accessible for end customers, and to make for end customers the idea of getting on top of this problem much more of a realistic, well, do you know what, we could do this, and if we do, here's the potential value it's going to drive. So yeah, I think it's going to be an exciting time over the next couple of years. I think that's a great point to wrap it up. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a chat. Yeah, it's going to be an interesting time.
It's going to be a fun time. Come on, interesting and fun. It's all going to be good.
Excellent. A little bit like, hopefully, the rest of the Ashes series is going to be. What did we say earlier? A little bit spicy.
I want it a little spicier. Yeah, that'd be good. That'd be good. I enjoy a good contest.
Superb. Excellent. Well, listen, thank you so much, Mick. Really appreciate it. And yeah, look forward to speaking to you again soon.
All right, take care. Thank you.
Cheers.